Captain Isabella Cortez watched her ship burn as the massive pirate vessel pulled alongside the wreckage. She had commanded these waters for 5 years, but now flames consumed everything she had built. The giant who stepped onto her deck stood nearly 7 feet tall, his presence commanding even the wind to still. His crew whispered his name with reverence and terror. Blackwater Kane, the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. His dark eyes studied her with curious intensity as she stood defiant among the ruins of her life. Then his voice boomed across the water, deep as thunder and twice as dangerous. "You'll warm my bed tonight, and I'll build you a new ship tomorrow." The words hung between them like a promise and a threat. But what kind of man destroys a woman's ship only to offer her a better one? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella had never imagined her story would begin with betrayal. But looking back, perhaps she should have seen the signs. Her father, Admiral Diego Cortez, had spent her childhood filling her head with tales of naval glory and maritime honor, never suspecting that his daughter would one day steal away in the night to claim her own piece of the endless blue. The brass compass that now lay somewhere beneath the Caribbean waves had been his parting gift on her 16th birthday. "The captain is only as good as her ability to find true north," he had said, pressing the cool metal into her palm. She had treasured that compass for 6 years, using it to navigate not just the treacherous waters between islands, but the equally dangerous world of independent seafaring. Isabella's rise to captaincy had been neither swift nor easy. Women who commanded their own vessels were rare as honest politicians, and twice as likely to meet violent ends. She had started as a cook's assistant aboard a merchant vessel, learning the rhythms of ship life while keeping her ears open and her ambitions hidden. When pirates had attacked that first ship, she had been the only crew member to escape, not through cowardice but through cunning. She had convinced the attacking captain that she possessed knowledge of Spanish treasure routes, spinning tales elaborate enough to keep her alive and valuable enough to earn her a place among his crew. For 2 years she had sailed with pirates, learning their methods while plotting her own course. When the opportunity finally presented itself during a port visit to Tortuga, she had gathered 3 loyal men and appropriated a small sloop, declaring herself captain of her own destiny. The years that followed had been a careful balance of legitimate trade and strategic piracy. Isabella targeted only Spanish treasure ships and slavers, earning her a reputation as both a skilled navigator and a captain with principles. Her crew had grown to 12 men, all of whom had chosen to follow her rather than accept her leadership grudgingly. They respected her not because she was unusual for a woman, but because she was exceptional as a captain. Marcus, her first mate, had been with her since those early days in Tortuga. The grizzled sailor had lost his left eye to a Spanish cutlass, but had gained something more valuable, in return unwavering loyalty to the woman who had saved his life during a brutal storm off the coast of Jamaica. Elena, the only other woman in her crew, served as both gunner and surgeon, her steady hands equally skilled at loading cannons and stitching wounds. Young Thomas, barely 18 but already seasoned by 2 years of Caribbean adventures, had joined them after Isabella had liberated him from a slave ship bound for the sugar plantations. His gratitude had transformed into fierce devotion, and his quick mind had made him invaluable for planning their more complex operation. Then there was Roberto, their navigator after Isabella herself, whose knowledge of hidden coves and secret waterways throughout the Caribbean had saved them from pursuing naval vessels more times than anyone could count. His charts, hand-drawn and meticulously updated, were works of art that rival captains would kill for. All of them were gone now, consumed by flames or claimed by the sea during Blackwater Kane's brutal assault on their vessel. Isabella had watched Marcus fall with a cutlass wound to his chest, had seen Elena's horrified face disappear beneath the waves, had heard Thomas calling her name as the deck collapsed beneath his feet. Their deaths weighed on her heart like anchors, dragging her down into depths of guilt and rage. Kane's reputation preceded him across every port in the Caribbean, like a storm front. Stories of his exploits varied in their details, but agreed on essential facts. He was massive in stature, ruthless in battle, and commanded the largest, fastest ship anyone had ever seen. The Leviathan was said to be cursed, built from timber taken from a dozen captured vessels, and armed with cannons that never missed their targets. Some claimed Kane had made a deal with sea devils to gain his powers. Others insisted he was the bastard son of a Spanish duke who had turned to piracy after being denied his inheritance. The most persistent rumors suggested he had once been a naval officer himself, trained in the finest maritime academies before some great betrayal had driven him to the wrong side of the law. What everyone agreed upon was that crossing Blackwater Kane meant death, and ships that flew his black flag were given wide berth by anyone with sense enough to value their lives over their cargo. Isabella had avoided his waters carefully, building her own reputation in regions where his influence was lighter, until today when her careful navigation had failed her completely. The Leviathan's captain's quarters defied every expectation Isabella had formed about pirate ships. Where she had anticipated squalor and chaos, she found instead a cabin that rivaled the finest chambers aboard any naval flagship. Rich mahogany panels lined the walls, inlaid with intricate carvings that spoke of master craftsmanship. Crystal decanters caught the light from brass lanterns that swayed gently with the ship's movement, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs that must have cost more than most captains earned in a year. Kane's obsidian ring caught her attention as he poured rum into 2 crystal glasses. The black stone was carved with symbols she didn't recognize, but the way he wore it suggested more than mere ornamentation. It sat on his right hand like a badge of office, dark as the depths of the ocean and twice as mysterious. "You're wondering how a savage pirate came by such refined tastes," Kane said without looking up from the bottles. His voice carried traces of education that belied the rough reputation that preceded him across the Caribbean. "I'm wondering why a man who destroys ships for sport would promise to build me a new one," Isabella replied, accepting the glass he offered while maintaining careful distance between them. Kane's laugh was deep and genuine, transforming his fearsome features into something almost approachable. "Perhaps because I recognize quality when I see it. Your navigation during that chase was masterful, even with a damaged rudder and half your rigging gone." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from anger or unexpected pleasure at the compliment, she couldn't say. "Flattery from the man who killed my crew seems particularly hollow. Your crew chose to fight rather than surrender. I gave them that option." Kane settled into a leather chair that creaked under his massive frame. "You, however, never lowered your color. Even with your ship burning around you, you stood there like some ancient sea goddess, defiant to the last." The comparison stirred something uncomfortable in Isabella's chest. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of her mother's miniature portrait hidden within the silver casing. Her mother had been the one to fill her childhood with stories of fierce women who commanded respect through strength rather than submission. Carmen Cortez had died when Isabella was 12, but her influence lived on in every decision her daughter made. "Your reputation suggests you take what you want without asking permission," Isabella said, studying Kane over the rim of her glass. The rum was excellent, smoother than anything she had tasted in years. "My reputation serves its purpose. Fear prevents many unnecessary battles." Kane leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "But you should know that I have never taken a woman against her will, despite what the songs in taverns might suggest." Isabella found herself studying his features with unwelcome interest. Up close, Kane was undeniably handsome in a way that spoke of good breeding and careful education. His hands, though scarred from battle, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to fine things. His speech, when he wasn't bellowing orders across the water, carried the cadence of formal schooling. "Then what exactly are you proposing?" she asked, setting down her glass with deliberate care. "Partnership," the word hung between them like cannon smoke. "You need a ship and crew. I have both in abundance." You possess navigation skills that could make my operations far more profitable. I have resources that could make your independence sustainable, and the sleeping arrangements you mentioned so publicly." Kane's smile was dangerous and entirely too appealing. "I believe in being direct about my intentions. You're a beautiful woman, and I'm not a monk, but I'm also not a fool who mistakes physical desire for ownership." Isabella felt her pulse quicken despite her better judgment. There was something magnetic about Kane's confidence. The way he spoke of desire is simply another factor to be negotiated. Her years of maintaining authority over crews of rough men had taught her to recognize genuine respect from mere manipulation, and Kane's interest seemed refreshingly honest. "You destroyed everything I built," she said, testing the waters of this strange negotiation. "I destroyed what was. I'm offering to help you build something greater." Kane rose and moved to the stern windows, gazing out at the darkening Caribbean sky. "Your ship was well maintained, but small. Your crew was loyal but limited. With my resources behind you, you could command a fleet." Isabella joined him at the windows, noting how his presence seemed to fill the space without crowding her. The sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful enough to make her forget, momentarily, the morning's violence. "And what would you want in return for this generosity?" Kane turned to face her, and Isabella found herself caught by the intensity in his dark eyes. "Your loyalty, your expertise, your company." He paused, his voice dropping to something approaching tenderness. "Your trust, if I can earn it." Isabella woke to the sound of hammering and the scent of fresh-cut timber. Through the porthole of the cabin, Kane had assigned her separate from his own. True to his word, she could see a secluded cove where his crew had anchored for the night. What she hadn't expected was the sight of Kane himself, stripped to the waist and working alongside his men in the morning sun. The ancient woodworking tools in his hands moved with practiced precision, each strike of the adze shaping timber with the confidence of a master craftsman. These weren't ordinary pirate implements. The chisels and planes bore the patina of generations, their wooden handles worn smooth by countless hands. Isabella recognized quality when she saw it, and these tools spoke of tradition and skill passed down through bloodlines. "He learned from his father," said a voice behind her. Isabella turned to find Kane's quartermaster, a weathered man named Briggs, watching her with knowing eyes. "Those tools belonged to the finest shipwright in Portsmouth. Built vessels for the Royal Navy before." He trailed off, apparently deciding he'd said enough. "Before what?" Isabella pressed, but Briggs had already melted away into the shadows with the practiced invisibility of a long-time subordinate. Isabella dressed quickly and made her way to the beach, where the skeleton of a ship was already taking shape. Kane looked up from his work as she approached, sweat glistening on his broad chest. Wood shavings caught in his dark hair. The sight stirred something in her that she tried to ignore. "You weren't lying about building me a ship," she said, examining the elegant lines of the hull taking form. "I never lie about my promises." Kane set down his tools and reached for his shirt. "Though I confess I have selfish reasons for wanting to see you properly equipped." Our ship's design was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. Sleeker than a sloop, but more substantial than a brigantine, with lines that suggested both speed and stability. Kane had clearly put considerable thought into creating something that would suit her particular needs as a captain. "She'll carry 14 guns and a crew of 30, Kane explained, running his hand along the smooth planking. "Fast enough to outrun naval frigates, but with enough firepower to discourage most pursuers." "And you expect me to believe you're doing this purely from generosity?" Kane's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. "Generosity has nothing to do with it. I need allies, not subordinates. The Caribbean is changing. Isabella, the days of independent pirates operating without consequence are numbered. We need to adapt or die." As if summoned by his words, a sail appeared on the horizon. Kane's men immediately reached for weapons, but their captain raised a hand for calm. Isabella recognized the ship's silhouette, a heavily armed galleon flying Spanish colors, but moving with the purpose of a hunter rather than a merchant. "Captain Mendoza," Kane said, his voice hardening. Right on schedule. The approaching vessel flew a black flag beneath its Spanish banner, the mark of a privateer operating with official sanction. Isabella had heard whispers of Mendoza, in ports throughout the Caribbean, a Spanish nobleman turned pirate hunter, who had been granted broad authority to eliminate threats to colonial shipping. Old enemy? Isabella asked, noting how Kane's crew had formed up without orders, each man moving to his assigned position with the precision of long practice. Eduardo Mendoza fancies himself my equal, Kane replied, never taking his eyes off the approaching ship. He's been hunting me for 3 years, ever since I took a prize he considered his own. The galleon San Venganza anchored just outside the cove's mouth, its gun ports open in clear threat. A launch was lowered, carrying a single figure toward the beach. Isabella could see the man's elaborate uniform even at distance, all gold braid and ceremonial sword, the costume of someone who valued appearance over substance. Captain Mendoza proved to be everything his reputation suggested. Handsome in a refined way that spoke of noble breeding, arrogant in the manner of men born to privilege, and dangerous in the cold-blooded fashion of those who killed for sport rather than necessity. His eyes fixed on Isabella with immediate and unwelcome interest. Kane Mendoza called out in accented English, "I see you've acquired a new pet. How charming." Isabella felt Kane tense beside her, but his voice remained level. "What do you want, Mendoza?" "The same thing I always want, your head on a pike." Mendoza's smile was all sharp edges. "But perhaps we can negotiate. The woman intrigues me. I'm willing to overlook your latest crimes in exchange for her company." The casual way he spoke of trading her like cargo made Isabella's blood boil, but before she could respond, Kane stepped forward. His presence seemed to fill the beach, making even his enormous frame seem larger. "The lady is under my protection," Kane said quietly, and somehow that whisper carried more menace than any shout. Mendoza's laugh was cultured and completely without humor. "We shall see how long that protection lasts, mi amiga." Life aboard the Leviathan proved more complex than Isabella had anticipated. Kane's crew treated her with cautious respect, curious about the woman their captain had claimed, but uncertain how to navigate the unusual dynamics of her presence. She found herself in the peculiar position of being neither prisoner nor crew member, but something entirely new in their experience. The torn piece of her ship's flag, salvaged from the wreckage and now kept in her cabin, served as a constant reminder of what she had lost. The deep blue fabric with its silver compass rose had represented her independence, her authority, her identity as a captain. Now it lay folded in her sea chest, like a funeral shroud, a symbol of the life that had ended in flames and cannon smoke. Kane had given her the freedom to move about the ship, and Isabella used that privilege to learn everything she could about the Leviathan and her crew. The ship itself was a marvel of maritime engineering, larger than any pirate vessel she had ever seen, but designed with a keen understanding of speed and maneuverability. Every line and timber spoke of careful planning and masterful construction. The crew numbered nearly 60 men, drawn from every corner of the Caribbean. Former slaves worked alongside Spanish deserters. English convicts sailed beside French refugees, and all were united by loyalty to their massive captain. Isabella quickly realized that Kane commanded not through fear alone, but through a combination of fair treatment, shared profit, and genuine leadership that inspired devotion. Her first real test came during the 3rd day, when storm clouds gathered on the horizon with the ominous speed that marked Caribbean weather. Kane found her standing at the bow, watching the approaching tempest with the practiced eye of an experienced navigator. "Storm's moving fast," he observed, joining her at the rail. "What do you make of it?" Isabella studied the cloud formations, noting the particular way the wind patterns shifted across the water's surface. Her years of independent sailing had taught her to read weather signs that many captains missed, skills that had kept her small crew alive through numerous dangerous passages. "It'll hit us within 2 hours," she said confidently, "but see how the clouds are layered. This isn't just wind and rain. There's a spiral forming to the south. If we alter course now, We can use the storm's edge winds to gain speed instead of fighting the full force." Kane called for his sailing master, a grizzled veteran named Morrison, who had been reading Caribbean weather for 30 years. Isabella repeated her assessment, pointing out the subtle signs she had noticed. Morrison studied the horizon with narrowed eyes, then nodded slowly. "The lady's right, Captain. I missed the spiral formation, but now that she's pointed it out, I can see it clear enough." What followed was Isabella's first real demonstration of her nautical expertise to Kane's crew. She took position beside the helmsman, calling out course corrections as the Leviathan danced along the storm's edge. The ship responded like a thoroughbred, her massive frame cutting through increasingly heavy seas with grace that belied her size. When lightning began to fork across the sky, Isabella noticed young crew members looking nervous. These were experienced sailors, but some were clearly inexperienced with the kind of violent storms that could tear ships apart in minutes. Without thinking, she began calling out encouragement instruction, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced such challenges before. "Steady as she goes," she called to the helmsman. "The wind's going to shift hard to port in about 30 seconds. Be ready to compensate." She turned to address a group of sailors, securing the rigging. "Keep those lines tight, but don't over-tighten. Let the ship breathe with the wave." Kane watched from the quarterdeck, saying nothing but missing nothing. Isabella realized he was evaluating her leadership abilities, testing whether she could truly command respect from men who owed her no loyalty. The thought should have made her nervous, but instead she found herself energized by the challenge. The storm raged for 6 hours, but Isabella's navigation kept them in the relatively calm waters along its periphery. By the time the weather cleared, the Leviathan had made excellent time toward their destination, and Isabella had earned something more valuable than Kane's protection. She had gained the crew's respects. That evening, she found herself teaching basic navigation to some of the younger crew members. Pedro, a boy barely 16 who had joined the crew after his fishing village was destroyed by slavers, showed particular aptitude for reading the stars. Isabella remembered her own hunger for knowledge at that age. The way her father's lessons had opened up the entire world of possibilities. "Navigation isn't just about finding your destination," she explained, showing Pedro how to use the quadrant to measure stellar position. "It's about understanding the relationship between where you are, where you want to go, and all the forces that might push you off course." Kane appeared beside them as if from nowhere, his massive frame casting a shadow across their impromptu classroom. "Wise words," he said quietly. "Perhaps the most honest definition of seamanship I've ever heard." Isabella discovered Kane's secret by accident. She had been searching for charts in what she assumed was a storage room when her hand brushed against a hidden latch. The wall panel swung inward, revealing a space that took her breath away. Books, hundreds of them, leather-bound volumes that filled floor-to-ceiling shelves in a hidden library that ran the length of the stern cabin. The collection was story works of philosophy and science, treatises on navigation and engineering, volumes of poetry in multiple languages, and historical texts that would have been prized by any university. The air smelled of aged leather and parchment, a perfume that spoke of learning and contemplation. Kane found her there an hour later, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a volume of Cervantes open in her lap, completely absorbed in reading. She looked up guiltily, expecting anger at her trespass, but found instead something that might have been relief in his dark eyes. "I wondered when you would find this place," he said, settling into a chair that had clearly been positioned for reading. "Most of my crew believes books are useful only for starting fires. These are incredible," Isabella said, gesturing at the shelves around them. "Some of these volumes must be worth more than entire ships. How did a pirate acquire such a collection?" Kane was quiet for so long that Isabella began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that she recognized from her own moments of grief. "Because before I was Blackwater Kane, I was Lieutenant Commander William Kane of His Majesty's Royal Navy. I graduated from the Naval Academy at Portsmouth with highest honors. I served on 3 ships of the line and was being groomed for command of my own frigate." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching. I believed in honor, duty, and the righteousness of the Crown's mission in the Caribbean. Isabella set down the book, sensing that she was about to hear something Kane rarely shared. The vulnerability in his voice was at odds with everything she had thought she knew about the fearsome pirate captain. "What changed?" she asked softly. "I discovered that my commanding officer, Admiral Harrington, was selling naval supplies to smugglers while claiming they had been lost to pirate attacks. When I reported it through proper channels, I learned that the corruption went all the way to the Colonial Office. They needed someone to blame for the missing supplies, and I had made myself a convenient target by asking inconvenient questions." Kane rose and pulled a leather-bound journal from one of the shelves. Isabella recognized it as a ship's log, but the entries were written in Kane's careful script rather than an official hand. "They court-martialed me for the very crimes I had tried to expose. Stripped of rank, imprisoned, branded a traitor to the Crown I had served faithfully for 15 years. How did you escape?" "I didn't escape. I was rescued." Kane's smile was bitter. "By pirates who attacked the prison ship, transporting me to the penal colonies. They thought they were liberating cargo, but found only a disgraced officer who had lost everything he believed in." Isabella felt something shift in her understanding of the man before her. The education, the refined quarters, the complex honor code that governed his crew, all of it made sense now. Kane wasn't a savage who had learned to mimic civilization. He was a civilized man who had been forced into savagery. "You could have returned to England, cleared your name eventually," she said. "With what evidence? The men who destroyed me were powerful, well-connected. Besides," Kane gestured at the books surrounding them, "I discovered something unexpected in this life: freedom, the ability to choose my own course, to protect those who serve with me, to answer only to my own conscience." Isabella stood and moved closer to him, drawn by the pain she heard beneath his words. "You've built something honorable here, despite everything. Have I, or have I simply found more elegant ways to justify theft and violence?" Kane's eyes met hers, searching for judgment or understanding. Instead of answering directly, Isabella reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "You saved my life when you could have let me drown. You've treated me with respect when most men would have seen only an opportunity. You're building me a ship when you could have simply taken what you wanted by force." She paused, surprised by her own certainty. "Whatever you were forced to become, you haven't lost who you are." Kane caught her hand against his cheek, his eyes closing as if her touch brought him peace. When he opened them again, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by something that made Isabella's pulse quicken. "Dangerous words, Isabella. You might convince me to believe them. Maybe that's exactly what I intend to do." Mendoza's challenge came at dawn, delivered by a Spanish messenger who spoke with the formal precision of diplomatic protocol. The terms were specific and steeped in the archaic traditions of maritime honor: single combat between captains, fought with cutlass and pistol on neutral ground, with the victor claiming rights to both ships and crews. "And the woman, of course," the messenger added with a knowing smile that made Isabella want to reach for her blade. Kane's response was immediate and final. "Tell your captain I accept his challenge, but make one thing clear: Isabella Cortez is not property to be wagered. She belongs to no man and never will." The silver cutlass that Mendoza sent as his formal challenge gleamed like captured moonlight, its blade etched with Spanish prayers, and its guard worked in the shape of a coiled serpent. Isabella recognized the craftsmanship as Toledo steel, the finest blades money could buy, designed not just as weapons, but as statements of wealth and breeding. "Pompous bastard," Kane muttered, examining the blade with professional interest. "Trust Mendoza to turn a death match into a display of his father's money." The news of the impending duel spread through both crews like wildfire. Isabella watched Kane's men prepare for the confrontation with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had seen their captain face death before. There was no panic, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet confidence of men who trusted their leader's abilities. But Isabella felt anything but confident. She had seen Kane fight during the raid that destroyed her ship, had witnessed the deadly precision with which he wielded his blade, but Mendoza was no ordinary opponent. The Spanish captain had earned his reputation through a dozen successful duels, and his connection to the colonial government meant he could afford the finest training that European masters could provide. "You don't have to do this," Isabella said, finding Kane alone in his cabin as he cleaned his weapons. "There has to be another way." Kane looked up from sharpening his cutlass, his dark eyes unreadable. "Do you think I'm afraid of him? I think you're honorable enough to die for a principle that might not be worth your life." Isabella moved closer, noting the careful way he tested the blade's edge. "Mendoza wants me, yes, but he wants to destroy you more. This duel isn't about possession, it's about revenge. Then perhaps it's time we settled old accounts." Kane set down his whetstone and turned to face her fully. 3 years ago, Mendoza captured a slave ship I had taken as a prize. Instead of returning the cargo to their homes as I intended, he sold them back into bondage and pocketed the profit. When I recaptured the ship and freed the slaves permanently, I made an enemy. Isabella felt her stomach clench at the casual mention of human cargo, but Kane's next words revealed the moral complexity she was still learning to understand about his character. "I became a pirate to survive, Isabella, but I chose what kind of pirate to be. Some lines I will not cross, some compromises I will not make. If that means facing men like Mendoza in single combat, so be it." The duel was set for noon on a small uninhabited island that both crews knew well. As the Leviathan approached the designated spot, Isabella could see the San Venganza already anchored in the shallow bay. Mendoza's men were arranging what looked like a festival, colorful banners, a small platform for viewing, even musicians to provide appropriate atmosphere. "He's turned our confrontation into entertainment," Kane observed with disgust. Isabella watched Mendoza through her spyglass as he performed elaborate warm-up exercises on the beach. His movements were fluid and precise, each gesture calculated to display his skill to maximum advantage. He wore a pristine white shirt, open at the collar, black breeches that fit like a second skin, and boots polished to mirror brightness. Everything about his appearance suggested a man going to a social gathering rather than mortal combat. Kane, by contrast, dressed simply in dark clothing that would show bloodstains less readily. His preparation was internal rather than external, meditation rather than display, focus rather than performance. Isabella realized she was seeing two completely different philosophies of leadership: Mendoza's theatrical confidence versus Kane's quiet certainty. As the boats were lowered to carry the combatants to shore, Isabella made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm coming with you." Kane turned to stare at her. "Absolutely not. This is between Mendoza and me. This is about me whether I participate or not." Isabella replied firmly, "I won't sit safely aboard ship while two men fight over my theoretical ownership. If I'm truly not property to be wagered, then I should have a voice in this matter." The logic was unassailable, though Kane clearly didn't like it. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded curtly. "Stay behind the lines no matter what happened." As they rowed toward the island, Isabella fingered the hilt of her own blade and wondered if Kane's sense of honor would prove stronger than Mendoza's thirst for revenge. The storm struck with the sudden violence that marked the worst Caribbean tempest. What had begun as scattered clouds on the horizon transformed within hours into a howling monster that turned day to night and the sea into a cauldron of foam and fury. Both crews found themselves fighting not each other, but the ocean itself. Isabella's new ship sat in the protected cove where Kane's men had been working on her, still incomplete, but far enough along that her lines were visible. The ship's bell, newly cast and bearing an inscription in Latin that Isabella hadn't yet had translated, hung silent in the mounting wind. Kane had presented it to her the evening before, with unusual ceremony, explaining that it would be the first sound her crew would hear each morning and the last each night. Now, as rain lashed the beach in sheets and waves crashed over the partially constructed hull, Isabella feared the bell might never ring at all. The combined crews had taken shelter in a series of caves that honeycombed the island's interior. The rocky chambers provided protection from wind and rain, but forced natural enemies into uncomfortably close quarters. Mendoza's men eyed Kane's crew with suspicious hostility, while both groups regarded Isabella with the confusion of sailors who had never encountered a woman who commanded rather than served. Kane found Isabella tending to a young sailor who had been struck by debris during the evacuation. The boy couldn't have been more than 17, and blood from a scalp wound had soaked through the bandage she had improvised from torn sailcloth. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound and applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "You have medical training," Kane observed, settling beside them on the cave floor. "My mother taught me," Isabella replied without looking up from her patient. She said that anyone who commanded others should know how to heal as well as harm. The memory brought a pang of loss that she pushed aside. "This boy needs proper stitching, but I can keep the bleeding controlled until the storm passes." Mendoza appeared from deeper in the cave system, his perfect uniform somehow still immaculate, despite their desperate flight from the weather. He watched Isabella work with calculating eyes that made her skin crawl. "How touching," he said in his cultured accent. "The lady pirate plays at being a surgeon. Tell me, Corrida, do you also know how to prepare the dead for burial? It seems a more practical skill for one in your profession." Isabella looked up sharply, her hands never pausing in their ministrations. "I know how to keep men alive, Captain Mendoza. Perhaps you should concern yourself with protecting your own crew instead of making threats." Kane's presence beside her radiated controlled violence. "Careful, Mendoza. Storm or no storm, I can still split your skull if you continue insulting the lady." "The lady," Mendoza repeated mockingly. "How quickly we assign noble titles to common criminals." He gestured around the cave, where both crews huddled in uneasy truth. "Look at us, reduced to cowering together, like rats while the sea rages above. Is this the grand adventure you promised your followers, Kane?" Before Kane could respond, a tremendous crash echoed through the cave system. Rock dust rained from the ceiling, and several men cried out in alarm. Isabella realized that waves must be striking the cliff face directly above them, each impact testing the structural integrity of their shelter. "The entrance passage is flooding," called Morrison, Kane's sailing master, as he splashed through knee-deep water that hadn't been there minutes before. "If the water level rises much more, we'll be trapped." Isabella looked around at the assembled men, 60 souls whose lives now depended on decisions made in the next few minutes. The rivalry between Kane and Mendoza seemed petty in the face of potential drowning, but she could see that neither captain was willing to show weakness by suggesting cooperation. "There's another way out," she said, surprising everyone including herself. During her exploration of the cave system, she had noticed air currents that suggested additional passages. "I felt wind coming from deeper in the caves. There has to be another opening." Kane studied her face in the flickering torchlight. "You're certain?" "Certain enough to bet our lives on it," Isabella replied, then realized that was exactly what they were being asked to do. The evacuation through unknown passages in complete darkness, with water rising behind them and uncertain terrain ahead, became a nightmare of logistics and trust. Isabella found herself naturally taking charge of organizing the movement, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. She assigned the strongest swimmers to help men who couldn't navigate flooded sections, paired experienced cavers with those who had never been underground, and kept the entire group moving steadily deeper into the island's interior. Even Mendoza's men looked to her for guidance, when their own captain seemed paralyzed by the unfamiliar environment. Kane stayed beside her throughout the ordeal, but Isabella realized he was letting her lead. In the midst of crisis, with both crews' survival depending on quick thinking and decisive action, he was demonstrating his trust in her judgment more clearly than any words could have conveyed. The revelation came through a letter that changed everything. Isabella thought she knew about herself and her situation. The parchment was official, bearing the seal of the colonial governor of Jamaica, and it had been hidden in Mendoza's personal effects that Kane's men had salvaged from the San Venganza after the storm had driven the ship onto the rock. Isabella stared at the royal pardon, her hands trembling as she read words that offered redemption for crimes she had never committed, freedom from charges she had never faced. The document was made out in the name of Isabella Cortez, daughter of Admiral Diego Cortez, and it granted full amnesty for acts of piracy and rebellion against the crown in exchange for her safe return to her father's custody. "Your father has been negotiating your release for months," Kane said quietly, watching her face as the implications sank in. "He believes you were taken by pirates against your will." The weight of deception settled on Isabella's shoulders like a lead cape. Her father, the man she had run away from to claim her own destiny, had been working tirelessly to secure her freedom from a captivity that had never existed. Every day she had spent building her reputation as an independent captain. He had spent believing she was a prisoner, suffering for her defiance. "He doesn't know I chose this life," Isabella whispered, sinking into a chair in Kane's cabin. The royal pardon crackled in her grip as her hands continued to shake. "He thinks I'm a victim." Kane poured rum into 2 glasses, but didn't drink from his own. "Mendoza was supposed to deliver this to you as proof of his good intention. Your father promised him a substantial reward for your safe return, along with his influence to secure Mendoza an official appointment as a privateer captain." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Mendoza's interest in her hadn't been purely personal, it had been financial and political. By delivering the governor's daughter safely home, he would have secured both monetary reward and official legitimacy for his operations. Her value to him had been measured not in desire but in advancement. "How long has my father been searching for me?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. "According to the correspondence we found, he began inquiries within weeks of your disappearance. When no ransom demands came, he assumed the worst, but never stopped hoping." Kane finally took a sip of his rum, his eyes never leaving her face. "He loves you, Isabella. Whatever drove you to leave, he wants you home." Isabella stood and walked to the stern windows, watching the Caribbean sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The colors reminded her of the evening she had first stolen away from her father's house, driven by dreams of freedom and adventure that had seemed so important at 18. Now, 6 years later, those dreams felt more complicated. "I was supposed to marry Charles Whitmore," she said, without turning around. "The son of a plantation owner, chosen for his prospects, rather than any feeling between us. The wedding was arranged, the contracts signed, my entire future planned without consulting my wishes." She pressed her palm against the cool glass. "I couldn't bear the thought of becoming another man's property, traded between my father and husband like cargo." "And now?" Kane asked. Isabella turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that might have been fear. "Now I discover that my rebellion has caused my father years of anguish, that men have died believing they were rescuing an unwilling captive, that my freedom has cost other people their peace." Kane rose and moved to stand before her, his massive frame somehow gentle despite its intimidating size. "The choices you made were your own, Isabella. You couldn't have known how others would interpret your absence. But I know now." Isabella looked down at the pardon in her hand. "This changes everything, doesn't it? If I'm truly the governor's daughter, then keeping me here makes you a kidnapper in the eyes of the law. It gives them legitimate cause to hunt you. I told you before, you're free to leave whenever you choose." Kane's voice was steady, but Isabella caught the tension beneath his calm words. "If you want to return to Jamaica, to your father, I'll provide safe passage." Isabella studied his face, searching for any sign of what he truly wanted her to decide. The man who had once declared she would warm his bed was now offering to let her go, placing her choice above his own desires. The gesture revealed more about his character than any passionate declaration could have. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked softly. Kane's smile was dangerous and entirely too appealing. "Then we'll face the consequences together, whatever they may be." The betrayal came from within, as the most dangerous betrayals always do. Isabella discovered it by accident when she entered Kane's cabin to find his first mate, Briggs, hastily concealing what looked like correspondence. The man she had trusted, who had served Kane faithfully for 5 years, was selling information to the colonial authorities. The poisoned goblet sat on Kane's desk, its silver surface gleaming innocently in the lamplight. Briggs had prepared it carefully, rum mixed with enough arsenic to kill a man Kane's size within hours, but slowly enough that death would appear natural. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: poison the captain during the evening meal, then signal the approaching naval vessels when the Leviathan was leaderless and vulnerable. "You're early," Briggs said calmly, making no further effort to hide the papers scattered across Kane's desk. "I was hoping to complete this business before you returned." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her cutlass, but Briggs made no threatening moves. Instead, he seemed almost relieved that his deception had been discovered. The weight of betraying a man he respected had clearly been eating at him. "How long?" Isabella asked, keeping her distance from both Briggs and the poisoned cup. 3 months. Briggs admitted. "Since we took that Spanish treasure ship off Barbados, the authorities offered me a full pardon and enough gold to buy a small plantation in Virginia." He gestured toward the goblet with something that might have been shame. "All I had to do was deliver Kane to them. And the crew, your shipmates, who trust you with their lives." Briggs's face hardened. "The crew will be given the chance to surrender. Those who cooperate will be transported to the colonies as indentured servants instead of hanged. It's more mercy than most pirates receive." Isabella felt sick at the casual way he discussed the fate of men who considered him family. "Kane saved your life in Nassau, you told me yourself. Without him you'd have died in a Spanish prison." And I've repaid that debt with 5 years of loyal service." Briggs stood slowly, his hand resting on his pistol butt, but not drawing the weapon. "But a man has to think of his future, Isabella. Kane's war against the authorities can't last forever. Better to end it on terms that let some of us survive." The sound of boots on the deck above indicated that Kane was returning from his inspection of the ship's repairs. Isabella realized she had perhaps minutes to decide how to handle this crisis. She could call out to warn Kane, but that would likely result in Briggs's death and alert any other conspirators among the crew. Or she could attempt to neutralize the threat herself. "The naval ships," Isabella said, stalling for time while she evaluated her options. "How close are they?" "Close enough," Briggs replied. "Admiral Hartwell commands the squadron personally. He's been hunting Kane for 3 years, ever since that business with the court-martial. This is personal for him." Isabella's blood chilled at the name. Admiral Hartwell was the man responsible for Kane's disgrace, the corrupt officer whose crimes Kane had tried to expose. The betrayal ran deeper than simple piracy charges. This was about silencing a witness who could still threaten Hartwell's reputation. Kane's voice carried through the cabin door as he spoke to someone in the passageway. Isabella made her decision with the quick calculation that had kept her alive through 6 years of dangerous sailing. She grabbed the poisoned goblet and hurled its contents through the open stern window, then swept the correspondence into her skirts. "Isabella," Kane's voice called as his footsteps approached the cabin. "In here," she replied, positioning herself between Briggs and the door. Briggs was just explaining some concerns about crew morale. Briggs stared at her with something between gratitude and confusion. By destroying the poison and concealing the evidence, she had given him a chance to reconsider his betrayal. The question was whether he would take it. Kane entered the cabin with the easy confidence of a man in his own domain. But Isabella saw his expression sharpen as he took in the tension between her and Briggs. His survival instincts, honed by years of danger, immediately recognized that something was wrong. "What kind of concerns?" Kane asked carefully, his hand moving casually toward his sword hilt. Briggs looked between Isabella and Kane, decades of loyalty warring with months of careful planning. The papers Isabella had hidden contained detailed information about the Leviathan's capabilities, crew numbers, and planned routes. intelligence that would make Hartwell's attack devastatingly effective. "The men are nervous about staying in these waters," Briggs said finally. "Word is spreading that the navies increased their patrols. Maybe it's time to consider moving our operations further south." Isabella held her breath, waiting to see if Kane would accept this deflection or probe deep. The next few moments would determine whether Briggs chose redemption or continued down the path of betrayal. Isabella's new ship cut through the Caribbean waters like a blade through silk, her sleek hull responding to every shift of wind and current with precision that took Isabella's breath away. The wheel beneath her hands felt alive, transmitting every nuance of the vessel's movement through polished wood that Kane had shaped with his own hands. She had never commanded a ship that answered so perfectly to her intentions. Kane had named the vessel Redemption, though he claimed the choice was Isabella's to make. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Both captain and ship represented second chances, new beginnings built from the ashes of old failures. The ship's lines were elegant and deadly, designed for speed rather than cargo capacity, with gun ports that could accommodate 14 cannons and rigging that allowed a smaller crew to manage her effectively. "She handles like a dream," Isabella called to Kane, who stood beside the mainmast watching her work. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable, not just in the ship he had built, but in the woman who commanded her. The pursuing naval squadron had appeared on the horizon at dawn, 5 ships flying British colours and closing fast. Isabella's lookout had counted 3 frigates, a ship of the line, and what appeared to be a heavily armed sloop. More firepower than any pirate crew could hope to face in direct combat. But Kane had taught her that the secret to survival wasn't always in fighting. Sometimes it was in refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. Signal from the Leviathan, called Tommy Morrison, Isabella's new sailing master. The young man had volunteered to serve aboard Redemption when Kane offered his crew the choice of ships, drawn by Isabella's reputation and the chance to serve under a captain who valued skill over tradition. Isabella read Kane's signal through her spyglass. "Follow my lead. Trust the plan." What followed was the most audacious display of seamanship Isabella had ever witnessed. Kane positioned the Leviathan between the naval squadron and Redemption, using his larger ship's superior firepower to screen Isabella's escape while she maneuvered through a series of coral reefs that would have torn apart less skillfully handled vessels. The plan required perfect timing and absolute trust between the two captains. Isabella had to thread Redemption through passages barely wider than her beam, while Kane kept the pursuing warships occupied with a running battle that tested every aspect of his crew's training. One miscalculation by either captain would result in disaster for both ships. "Reef to starboard," Morrison called out as Redemption approached a particularly narrow channel. Isabella could see the coral formations beneath the crystal-clear water, beautiful and deadly as jeweled daggers waiting to rip through her ship's hull. She adjusted course by degrees, feeling the ship respond to her touch like a trained horse responding to an expert rider. Kane's craftsmanship had created something extraordinary, a vessel that combined the speed of a racing yacht with the durability of a warship, built with tolerances so precise that she could navigate channels that would trap larger vessels. Behind them, the Leviathan was fighting a masterful delaying action, using her superior knowledge of local waters to stay just out of effective cannon range, while preventing the naval squadron from pursuing Redemption directly. Isabella watched through her spyglass as Kane's crew executed maneuvers that would have been impossible with a less experienced team. "He's drawing them toward Devil's Triangle," Morrison observed, referring to a notorious area where conflicting currents and hidden rocks had claimed dozens of ships over the years. Risky move, even for Kane. Isabella understood the strategy immediately. The naval captains would be unfamiliar with these particular waters, relying on charts that couldn't capture the subtle variations in depth and current that local knowledge provided. Kane was using their inexperience against them, leading them into waters where his expertise would offset their numerical advantage. But the plan required Isabella to complete her part flawlessly. She had to navigate redemption through the reef maze and reach the predetermined rendezvous point where Kane would meet her if he survived the encounter with 5 warships. The next hour tested every skill Isabella had developed during her years of independent sailing. She called on memories of her father's lessons about reading water conditions, her own experience with Caribbean reef systems, and the intimate knowledge of her new ship's capabilities that she was gaining with each passing minute. When redemption finally cleared the last of the coral heads and reached open water, Isabella felt a surge of triumph that was immediately tempered by concern for Kane. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the water behind her, but she couldn't see the Leviathan's position through the maze of islands and reefs. There, Morrison pointed toward a gap between 2 small islands. The Leviathan's signal lantern. Isabella brought redemption around toward the rendezvous point, her heart racing with more than just the excitement of the chase. The partnership between their 2 ships had been perfect, but partnerships in battle were only as strong as their weakest link. The man who stepped onto the beach at the rendezvous point wore the gold-braided uniform of a British admiral, but Isabella would have recognized him anywhere. Admiral Diego Cortez carried himself with the bearing of a career naval officer, his silver hair perfectly groomed. Despite the long voyage, his weathered face bearing the dignity that came from 30 years of distinguished service. The war medal, pinned to his chest, caught the afternoon sunlight, a decoration Isabella remembered from childhood, awarded for his service in the Battle of Trafalgar. She had been 7 years old when he returned from that campaign, and she could still recall the mixture of pride and terror she had felt seeing her father in his dress uniform, understanding for the first time that he was someone important beyond their family circle. Now standing on the beach of a neutral island with Kane beside her, Isabella felt the weight of that childhood awe complicated by years of rebellion and the bitter knowledge of how much pain her choices had caused. Isabella, Admiral Cortez said simply, his voice carrying across the sand with the authority that had commanded fleets. My daughter. Kane had insisted on accompanying her to this meeting, despite Isabella's protests that it would only complicate matters. His presence beside her now felt both protective and dangerous. She could see the way her father's eyes assessed the massive pirate captain, calculating threat levels and tactical advantages with the instincts of a career military man. Father, Isabella replied, surprised by how formal her own voice sounded. You look well, as do you, though not as I expected to find you. Admiral Cortez's gaze took in Isabella's practical clothing, her sun-darkened skin, the cutlass at her hip, and the confident way she carried herself. When I received reports that you were sailing with pirates, I assumed the worst. The conversation carried undercurrents that Kane seemed to understand perfectly. Isabella realized that her father had come prepared for a rescue mission, expecting to find a daughter traumatized by captivity and grateful for salvation. Instead, he found a woman who had chosen her own path and seemed entirely comfortable with the consequences. I understand you've been negotiating for my release, Isabella said, pulling the royal pardon from her jacket. This is generous, but unnecessary. I was never taken against my will. Admiral Cortez's expression tightened as he processed the implications of her word. You're telling me that you chose this life, that you've been committing acts of piracy voluntarily. I'm telling you that I've been living the life I wanted instead of the one you chose for me. Isabella felt Kane's steadying presence beside her as she faced her father's disappointment. I know that's not what you hoped to hear. What I hoped, Admiral Cortez said carefully, was to find my daughter alive and bring her home safely. What I find instead is a woman I barely recognize, allied with enemies of the crown and apparently comfortable with lawlessness. Kane spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Your daughter has conducted herself with honor, Admiral. She's never harmed innocent civilians, never taken prizes that weren't legitimate targets, and never compromised her principles for profit. Admiral Cortez turned his full attention to Kane, and Isabella could see recognition dawn in her father's eyes. You're the former Lieutenant Commander Kane. I remember your court-martial, a shameful business that reflected poorly on the service. A business that your colleague Admiral Hartwell orchestrated to cover his own crimes. Kane replied evenly. I assume you know he's been hunting me personally rather than through proper naval channels. The admission clearly surprised Admiral Cortez. Isabella watched her father process this information, seeing the wheels turn as he reconsidered everything he thought he knew about the situation. Her father had always prized honor above all else, and the suggestion that a fellow admiral had acted dishonorably would trouble him deeply. You're suggesting that Hartwell's pursuit of you is motivated by personal vendetta rather than duty. I'm stating it as fact, Kane said. The evidence of his corruption still exists, Admiral, hidden but not destroyed. Your daughter has seen some of it. Isabella found herself caught between two worlds, her father's ordered universe of duty and hierarchy, and Kane's more complex reality of personal honor existing outside official structures. The conversation was really about more than her situation. It was about competing definitions of what constituted legitimate authority. Father, Isabella said, I know you've been worried about me. I know my leaving caused you pain, and I'm sorry for that. But I can't return to Jamaica to marry Charles Whitmore and pretend the last 6 years never happened. Admiral Cortez was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of sadness that cut deeper than anger would have. The daughter I remember was willful and independent, but she was also compassionate. She would never have wanted to cause her father years of anguish. He paused, then asked the question Isabella had been dreading. What happened to that girl? Isabella? She grew up, Isabella replied, and she learned that sometimes causing temporary pain is the price of avoiding permanent misery. The port of Tortuga had seen many strange gatherings, but few as tense as the convergence that now crowded its harbor. Isabella stood on the dock, watching as representatives from 3 different worlds prepared for what might be the final confrontation of her pirate career. The ancient scroll containing the pirate's code lay unrolled on a table in the harbor master's office, its parchment yellow with age and bearing the signatures of legendary captains who had helped establish the laws that governed Caribbean piracy. Kane studied the code with the attention he had once given to naval regulations, searching for precedents that might resolve their situation without bloodshed. The document was surprisingly sophisticated, addressing everything from the division of prize money to the resolution of disputes between captains. Most relevant to their current situation was Article 12, which established protocols for challenges involving matters of honor and the protection of non-combatants. According to this, Kane said, tracing the relevant passage with his finger, Mendoza has the right to demand single combat for what he terms theft of promised property. But the code also states that any person claimed as property has the right to refuse such designation and demand recognition as a free agent. Isabella's father, Admiral Cortez, examined the document with the professional interest of someone who had spent his career studying maritime law. Despite his disapproval of piracy in general, he seemed genuinely fascinated by the complex legal framework that governed what most people assumed was pure lawlessness. This is remarkably comprehensive, the Admiral admitted, more sophisticated than some actual naval regulations I've encountered. Mendoza arrived in full ceremonial dress, his uniform immaculate and his manner suggesting a man attending a social function rather than a potential death match. He brought with him a small army of witnesses and supporters, turning what should have been a simple challenge into a theatrical production designed to enhance his reputation, regardless of the outcome. The lovely Isabella," Mendoza said with elaborate courtesy, bowing deeply. "And Admiral Cortez, such an honor to meet Jamaica's most distinguished naval officer. I trust you appreciate the irony of finding your daughter protected by laws written by criminals." Admiral Cortez's expression remained carefully neutral. "I appreciate the complexity of the situation, Captain Mendoza, though I question whether matters of honor can be resolved through violence. Sometimes violence is the only language that men understand," Mendoza replied. "Your daughter has been promised to me through legitimate negotiation. Kane's interference with that arrangement constitutes theft under any reasonable interpretation of maritime law." Isabella stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority she had learned as a ship's captain. "I was never promised to you, Mendoza. I was never anyone's property to be negotiated over. The pirate's code you claim to invoke also guarantees my right to self-determination. The gathering crowd murmured approval at her words. Pirates might be criminals, but they understood the importance of personal freedom in ways that more civilized societies sometimes forgot. Isabella's claim of autonomy resonated with men who had chosen the dangerous freedom of the sea over the safe slavery of conventional life. Kane moved to stand beside Isabella, his massive presence, speaking without words about his willingness to defend her choices. The lady speaks for herself. Mendoza, if you have grievances with me, we can settle them directly. But Isabella's future is hers to determine. How noble, Mendoza sneered. The disgraced naval officer playing protector to the governor's wayward daughter. Tell me, Kane, does she know about your previous arrangements with other women, or does she believe herself special? Isabella felt Kane tense beside her, recognizing that Mendoza was trying to provoke him into making emotional rather than strategic decisions. She had learned enough about both men to understand that this confrontation was about much more than her supposed affections. It was about power, reputation, and old grudges that had nothing to do with her. My past arrangements are my business, Kane replied calmly. My current commitment is to ensuring that Isabella has the freedom to choose her own path, whatever that might be. The crowd had grown throughout the afternoon, drawn by the spectacle of two infamous captains preparing to settle their differences according to ancient tradition. Isabella realized that the outcome of this challenge would be discussed in taverns throughout the Caribbean for years to come, becoming part of the mythology that surrounded pirate culture. Admiral Cortez approached his daughter, speaking quietly so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the assembled crowd. Isabella, you don't have to be bound by these barbaric customs. I have ships waiting offshore. We can leave now before this escalates beyond control. Isabella looked at her father, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes, but also recognizing that his offer came from a fundamental misunderstanding of her situation. He still saw her as a victim to be rescued, rather than as a woman capable of making her own choices about the risks she was willing to accept. The ceremonial sword Kane drew from its scabbard had belonged to his father, passed down through 3 generations of naval officers who had served the crown with distinction before scandal and betrayal had driven their legacy into exile. The blade caught the Caribbean sun like captured lightning, its Toledo steel bearing engravings that spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, ideals that had shaped Kane's character even after circumstances had forced him beyond the law. Isabella watched from the designated viewing area as Kane and Mendoza faced each other in the center of a circle drawn in the sand. The rules of single combat were ancient and specific. Cutlass and pistol, fought until one man yielded or died, with no interference from seconds or witnesses. The winner would be acknowledged as the injured party, with all claims and grievances settled by the outcome. Mendoza moved with the fluid grace of a trained duelist, his blade work displaying the polish that came from years of formal instruction. He had clearly studied under European masters, learning techniques refined in the salons and academies of Spain and France. His attacks were precise, calculated, designed to display superior skill while wearing down his opponent's defenses. Kane fought with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned swordplay in actual combat rather than controlled training sessions. His movements were economical, each parry and thrust serving a tactical purpose rather than aesthetic display. Where Mendoza sought to impress the crowd with his technical proficiency, Kane focused entirely on survival and victory. The duel began cautiously, both men testing each other's reach and reflexes, while the gathered pirates and naval officers watched in tense silence. Isabella found herself holding her breath as steel rang against steel, each exchange potentially decisive in determining not just the winner of their personal conflict, but the future of everyone present. Admiral Cortez stood beside his daughter, his professional eye, evaluating both combatants with the detached analysis of someone who had witnessed many such encounters. Mendoza has superior training, he observed quietly, but Kane has the advantage of experience in actual life-or-death situations. Isabella nodded without taking her eyes off the fighters. She could see the truth of her father's assessment in the way each man approached the contest. Mendoza fought as if this were an elaborate performance, conscious of his audience and concerned with maintaining his reputation regardless of the outcome. Kane fought as if his life depended on victory, which, Isabella realized with growing dread, it probably did. The first blood went to Mendoza, a shallow cut across Kane's sword arm that drew cheers from the Spanish captain's supporters. The wound wasn't serious, but it demonstrated Mendoza's superior speed and precision in close combat. Kane stepped back, reassessing his opponent's capabilities, while blood trickled down his forearm. "First blood to me," Mendoza called out, his voice carrying clearly across the circle. Perhaps the famous Blackwater Kane would prefer to yield now, before this becomes truly unpleasant. Kane's response was to launch a furious attack that drove Mendoza backward, his heavy blade battering through the Spanish captain's defenses through sheer aggressive force. For several moments, it seemed that Kane might overwhelm his opponent's technical skills through raw determination, but Mendoza's footwork allowed him to escape the assault and regain his composure. The fight continued for nearly an hour, both men beginning to show signs of fatigue as the afternoon sun blazed overhead. Isabella watched Kane's movements become slightly slower, his breathing more labored, and realized that Mendoza's strategy was working. The Spanish captain was younger, probably in better physical condition, and his formal training had included endurance techniques that Kane might not have learned during his naval service. Then Admiral Hartwell arrived. Isabella's blood ran cold as she recognized the man who had destroyed Kane's naval career, stepping onto the beach with a squad of Marines at his back. Hartwell wore the uniform of a vice admiral now, his promotion clearly built on the reputation he had gained by destroying honest officers who threatened his corrupt schemes. "This illegal gathering is now terminated by order of Her Majesty's Navy," Hartwell announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "All persons present are subject to arrest for conspiracy, piracy, and treason against the Crown." The crowd began to disperse immediately, pirates and their supporters melting away into the maze of streets and alleys that surrounded Tortuga's harbor. But Kane and Mendoza remained locked in combat, too focused on their personal battle to fully register the changed circumstances. Isabella realized that this had been planned. Mendoza had likely arranged for Hartwell's timely arrival, turning the duel into a trap that would eliminate Kane regardless of who won their sword fight. If Kane defeated Mendoza, Hartwell's Marines would arrest him immediately. The whole elaborate ceremony of honor and tradition had been nothing more than a sophisticated betrayal. The aftermath of battle always brought a terrible clarity that was harder to bear than the chaos of combat itself. Isabella knelt beside Kane in the sand, her hands pressed against the sword wound in his side while his blood seeped between her fingers. The victory over Mendoza had come at a cost that might prove too high to pay. Kane's decisive thrust had found its mark, but not before the Spanish captain's blade had opened a gash that threatened to drain the life from the man she loved. Admiral Hartwell lay dead nearby, struck down by Kane's pistol shot in the moment when the corrupt officer had tried to arrest them both. The Marines who had accompanied him were now under the command of Isabella's father, their loyalty transferred by the simple expedient of Admiral Cortez, pulling rank and revealing Hartwell's crimes to men who still believed in honor and duty. The ship's charter that Admiral Cortez now held represented more than just legal documentation. It was a bridge between worlds, a way for Isabella and Kane to claim legitimacy without abandoning everything they had built together. The parchment bore official seals that would allow them to operate as privateers rather than pirates, hunting enemies of the Crown instead of any vessel that struck their fancy. "The wound isn't fatal," Isabella said, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. Kane had lost a significant amount of blood, and the sword thrust had come dangerously close to vital organs. "But you need proper medical attention, not battlefield surgery on a beach." Kane's eyes focused on her with difficulty, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. "Mendoza dead," Isabella replied simply. Your blade found his heart. The challenge is settled. Admiral Cortez approached carefully, his expression complex as he looked down at the man who had won his daughter's heart through violence and devotion in equal measure. The admiral carried himself with the bearing of someone who had just made decisions that would affect the rest of his career, possibly for the worse. "I've sent word to the Colonial Office," Admiral Cortez said. "Admiral Hartwell's death will be reported as occurring during the arrest of known criminals who resisted lawful authority. His crimes will be documented and investigated posthumously, which should clear your name, Kane, though it may take time." Isabella looked up at her father with surprise and gratitude. By taking this action, Admiral Cortez was risking his own reputation to provide Kane with a path back to legitimacy. The gesture spoke of a man who valued justice more than convenience, honor more than political expediency. "And us?" Isabella asked. "What happens to Kane and me?" Admiral Cortez pulled the charter from his jacket, its ribbons and seals catching the late afternoon light. "I'm prepared to offer you both commissions as privateers in service to the Crown. You would have letters of marque allowing you to take prizes from Spanish and French vessels, with the profits shared between yourselves and the colonial government." The offer was generous beyond anything Isabella had expected. Privateering was a legitimate profession, one that would allow them to continue their lives at sea while operating under official protection. Kane's skills and Isabella's knowledge would be valuable assets in the ongoing conflicts between European powers in the Caribbean. Kane struggled to sit up, Isabella supporting him with careful strength. "Why?" he asked Admiral Cortez. "You could simply arrest me and force Isabella to return home. It would be simpler, perhaps, but not just." Admiral Cortez studied Kane's face with the measuring gaze of someone evaluating character under extreme circumstances. "You fought honorably today, against an opponent who had betrayed the very codes he claimed to uphold. You've protected my daughter when others would have used her for their own advantage, and you've demonstrated skills that could serve the Crown well, if properly directed." Isabella felt tears threatening as she realized what her father was offering. Not just official legitimacy, but acceptance of her choices and recognition that Kane was worthy of her love. The gesture represented a fundamental shift in their relationship, from parent and rebellious child to equals capable of making decisions based on mutual respect. "There are conditions," Admiral Cortez continued. "You would operate under Admiralty oversight, with regular reports required and specific targets assigned. No more random piracy, no more attacks on neutral shipping. You would be officers of the Crown, bound by military law and naval discipline." Kane looked at Isabella, searching her face for guidance on a decision that would affect both their futures. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the appeal of legitimacy, warring with years of hard-won independence, the desire for her father's approval competing with the fear of losing the freedom that had defined his identity since his disgrace. "What do you think?" Kane asked her quietly. Isabella considered everything that had brought them to this moment: her rebellion against an arranged marriage, his betrayal by corrupt superiors, their growing love forged in the crucible of danger, and shared purpose. The choice represented more than just career decisions. It was about the kind of people they wanted to be and the kind of future they could build together. 6 months had transformed everything about their lives except the essential truth that held them together. Isabella stood at the altar of the small church in Port Royal, wearing a dress of ivory silk that her father had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Jamaica. The gown was beautiful, traditional, everything she had once sworn she would never wear, and yet, standing here beside Kane, she felt more herself than she ever had in practical ship's clothing. The wedding rings Kane had crafted told their own story of transformation and permanence. Forged from metal salvaged from both their ships, silver from the Leviathan's bell and brass from Redemption's compass. Housing the bands represented their separate histories, joined in common purpose. Kane had spent weeks in the forge, learning techniques he had never needed as a ship's carpenter, determined to create something worthy of the moment. Admiral Cortez performed the ceremony with the quiet dignity that had marked his entire career. Military protocol dictated that a ship's captain could marry crew members at sea, and the admiral had chosen to exercise that prerogative for his daughter's wedding. Isabella appreciated the symbolism, being married by her father aboard the ship that had become her new command, surrounded by the crew that had chosen to follow them into their legitimate future. The guest list reflected the unusual nature of their union. Kane's former crew members who had accepted privateer commissions stood alongside Isabella's new officers, many of whom were former Royal Navy personnel assigned to provide discipline and structure to their unconventional operation. Maria Santos sat in the front row, her proud smile worth more to Isabella than any elaborate gift. Tommy Chan had proven surprisingly effective as their new quartermaster, his accounting skills translating well to the complex business of managing prize money and crew shares under Admiralty oversight. His presence at the wedding represented the kind of continuity that had made their transition from piracy to privateering possible. Familiar faces in unfamiliar circumstances, trusted relationships adapted to new requirements. Dr. Niels had traveled from her retirement to attend the ceremony, bringing with her a collection of medical texts that would prove invaluable for treating injuries during their upcoming voyages. Her gift represented the kind of practical thoughtfulness that Isabella had learned to value more than elaborate gestures. Kane's recovery from the wounds he had suffered during the duel with Mendoza had been slower than either of them had hoped, but complete enough to allow him to resume active command. The scars would remain with him always, but Isabella had learned to see them as proof of his commitment rather than signs of weakness. He had bled for her freedom, and she would never forget that sacrifice. The privateering commission had proven both more restrictive and more rewarding than Isabella had anticipated. Their targets were limited to ships flying enemy flags or engaged in illegal trade, but the prizes were often more valuable than the random vessels they had taken as pirates. More importantly, they could sell their captures in legitimate ports, banking their profits openly instead of relying on black market dealers who cheated them systematically. Their crew had adapted to the new rules with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some of the older pirates had chosen to seek other employment rather than submit to Admiralty oversight, but most had remained, appreciating the security that came with official protection. They were no longer outlaws subject to hanging if captured. They were recognized combatants entitled to treatment as prisoners of war. Isabella's relationship with her father had evolved into something approaching professional respect. Admiral Cortez had initially assigned himself as their liaison to the colonial office, partly to protect his daughter's interests, but also to ensure that their operation contributed meaningfully to British naval strategy. The arrangement had worked better than anyone expected, with Isabella's local knowledge complementing her father's strategic understanding. The ceremony concluded with Kane kissing his bride, while cannon fire from both their ships celebrated the union. Isabella felt tears on her cheeks as she realized that this moment represented not the end of her adventures, but the beginning of a new chapter built on the foundation of everything they had survived together. As evening settled over Port Royal, Isabella and Kane stood on the quarterdeck of their flagship, watching the lights of the harbor twinkle like scattered stars. Their wedding celebration had been modest by the standards of her father's social circle, but perfect for two people who had learned to find joy in simple things earned through hard work and mutual devotion. "Any regret?" Kane asked, his arm around her waist as they gazed out at the Caribbean waters that had brought them together. "Only that it took us so long to get here," Isabella replied, leaning into his embrace, "and that we can't know what adventures are waiting for us." Kane's laugh rumbled through his chest, a sound that never failed to make Isabella smile. "I have a feeling we'll create our own adventures, Mrs. Kane. We always have." The title felt strange on her tongue, but Isabella found she liked the sound of it more than she had expected. She had spent years fighting against the idea of belonging to any man, but belonging with Kane felt entirely different. A partnership rather than possession, a choice renewed daily rather than a chain forged in law. The baby's cradle rocked gently with the motion of the ship, its sturdy construction a testament to Kane's craftsmanship and his growing excitement about fatherhood. He had built it from timber salvaged from both the Leviathan and Redemption, creating something that carried the history of their courtship into the future they were building together. The wood had been carefully selected and seasoned, joined with techniques that would ensure the cradle could survive decades of use and serve grandchildren yet to be born. Isabella watched her husband make final adjustments to the cradle's rockers, marveling at how naturally he had adapted to the prospect of becoming a father. The man who had once been feared throughout the Caribbean now spent his evenings carving tiny wooden toys and reading books about infant care, with the same intensity he had once devoted to naval tactics and ship design. Their son had been born during a calm morning in Port Royal, 6 months after their wedding and 3 days before they were scheduled to depart on their latest privateering mission. Isabella had insisted on naming him William, after Kane's father and the traditions that had shaped the man she loved. The baby bore Kane's dark hair and what appeared to be Isabella's stubborn temperament, crying with an authority that suggested he would grow up expecting his commands to be obeyed. "He's going to be a natural captain," Admiral Cortez observed, holding his grandson with the careful precision of someone who had forgotten how small newborns could be. The sight of her father cradling the baby brought Isabella a contentment she hadn't expected, the healing of old wounds through new connections. Kane looked up from his work on the cradle, his expression soft with wonder that hadn't diminished since William's birth. "He'll have choices we never did. Legitimate options, proper education, the chance to serve honorably if that's what he wants." The transformation in Kane's priorities had been gradual but profound. Where he had once measured success in prizes taken and enemies defeated, he now talked about establishing trust funds and ensuring their son would have access to the finest schools in England or the Americas. The pirate's pragmatic focus on survival had evolved into a father's long-term planning for a child's future. Isabella's own adaptation to motherhood had surprised her in different ways. She had expected to struggle with the restrictions that caring for an infant would place on her freedom, but instead found herself energized by the new dimension that William added to her sense of purpose. Every decision she made as a captain now carried additional weight, every risk calculated not just for herself and Kane, but for the child who depended on both of them. Their privateering operations had become more selective and strategic since William's birth. Isabella couldn't justify the extended voyages that had once been routine, but she discovered that shorter, more focused missions could be equally profitable. Her reputation as a navigator and Kane's skills as a tactician made them valuable to colonial administrators who appreciated results over dramatic gestures. Maria Santos had become an unofficial grandmother to William, her maternal instincts activated by the baby's presence in ways that brought tears to Isabella's eyes. The older woman had moved her own quarters closer to Isabella's cabin, claiming that someone needed to watch the child while his parents were busy with ship's business. But Isabella suspected that Maria simply enjoyed having a baby to fuss over. Tommy Chen had proven unexpectedly gifted with children, entertaining William with mathematical games that were far too advanced for an infant, but seemed to fascinate the baby nonetheless. Isabella often found Tommy holding William while explaining the principles of navigation or the basics of accounting, apparently convinced that early exposure to education would provide advantages later in life. The crew had adapted to having a baby aboard with the flexibility that marked experienced sailors. William's cries were no longer cause for alarm. His feeding schedule had become part of the ship's routine, and several of the men had appointed themselves unofficial protectors of the captain's son. Isabella realized that William was growing up in an extended family of sailors who would teach him skills no formal education could provide. Their relationship with Admiral Cortez had evolved into genuine partnership, with Isabella's father serving as both advisor and occasional babysitter when duty required both parents to focus on ship's business. The Admiral had embraced his role as grandfather with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. "I missed too much of your childhood," he had confessed to Isabella during one of his visits. "I won't make the same mistake with William." As evening settled over their anchorage, Isabella stood on the quarterdeck nursing her son while Kane made final preparations for departure. Their next mission would take them to intercept French smugglers operating out of Martinique, a task that combined legitimate privateering with the kind of tactical challenge that had always appealed to both of them. Red Kane asked, approaching with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his proper place in the world. Ready? Isabella confirmed, shifting William to her shoulder as she watched the harbor lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The first entry in their new ship's logbook was written in Isabella's careful script, recording not coordinates or weather conditions, but the beginning of a story that would be told for generations. The leather-bound volume represented more than ship's business. It was a chronicle of their continuing adventures together, a record of the family they were building on the foundation of love forged in fire and tested by the unforgiving sea. Little William Cortez Kane had taken his first steps on the swaying deck of redemption, much to his grandfather's delight and his mother's terror. At 18 months, he possessed his father's fearless nature and his mother's quick intelligence, investigating every corner of the ship with the thoroughness of a natural explorer. The crew had grown accustomed to the sight of their captain's son toddling around the deck under careful supervision, his presence bringing a lightness to their dangerous profession that none of them had expected. Kane stood at the bow watching the sunrise paint the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and rose, his son perched on his massive shoulders and babbling commentary that only he seemed to understand. The sight filled Isabella with contentment, so profound that she sometimes wondered if she was dreaming the entire transformation of their lives. Their privateering operations had proven remarkably successful, generating profits that allowed them to establish a permanent base in Port Royal, while maintaining the freedom to sail whenever adventure called. Kane had purchased a modest house near the harbor, but they all agreed that their true home remained the ship, with its familiar creaks and rhythms that had become the soundtrack of their family life. Admiral Cortez visited monthly, combining official admiralty business with grandfather duties that he performed with endearing seriousness. He had taught William to recognize ship types from their silhouettes, to identify cloud formations that indicated weather changes, and to count in both English and Spanish skills that would serve him well regardless of what profession he eventually chose. Maria Santos had formally joined their crew as William's governess, though her duties extended far beyond childcare. Her knowledge of Caribbean waters and her connections throughout the merchant community had proven invaluable for gathering intelligence about potential targets. She ruled the ship's domestic arrangements with the same authority. Isabella exercised over navigation, ensuring that William grew up surrounded by stability despite the unconventional nature of their lives. Tommy Chen had married a doctor's daughter from Kingston and brought his wife aboard as the ship's surgeon, creating a small community of families who had chosen to build their lives around the sea rather than on land. Their example had inspired several crew members to establish similar arrangements, transforming Redemption from a ship of bachelor sailors into something resembling a floating village. The legacy of their love story had already begun to spread through Caribbean folklore, with tavern singers composing ballads about the pirate captain who had built a ship for the woman who had captured his heart. Isabella found these romantic embellishments amusing, though they bore little resemblance to the complex reality of their relationship. The true story was both simpler and more profound than the myths, two people who had found in each other the courage to become better than they had been alone. Kane's influence on maritime law had been subtle but significant. His insistence on humane treatment of captured crews and protection of non-combatants had set standards that other privateer captains were beginning to adopt. The man who had once been driven from the Navy for trying to expose corruption had found a way to promote honor and justice from outside the system that had betrayed him. Isabella's own reputation had evolved from notorious pirate to respected naval commander, with younger women throughout the Caribbean citing her example when they sought their own unconventional careers. She had become proof that women could command respect through competence rather than connection, that the sea cared nothing for gender when skill and courage were what mattered. As the sun climbed higher, painting the water in brilliant blues that never failed to take Isabella's breath away, She joined her husband and son at the bow. William reached for her with chubby hands, babbling words that were becoming recognizable as Mama and Papa and what might have been ship. "Where shall we sail today, Captain?" Kane asked, using the formal title that still made Isabella's heart race with pride. Isabella looked out at the endless expanse of water that had given them everything: adventure, purpose, each other, and now a future that stretched as far as the horizon itself. Their ship carried letters of marque that would take them to the Windward Islands in pursuit of French privateers. But first they would sail simply for the joy of sailing, for the peace that came from being together on the water that had made their love possible. "Wherever the wind takes us," Isabella replied, taking the wheel and feeling the familiar thrill of command flow through her hands. "We have all the time in the world." Behind them their wake spread across the Caribbean like a silver road, leading to adventures yet to be written in the logbook of their shared life.